Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to look at the usage of VFX and CGI in the Last of Us series, on creating the outside world, buildings, and the use of CGI. So, basically, they first laid it all out, made sure that the buildings sit in the right place, then have the right amount of destruction on it, then edit the rubble piles on either side. And then obviously it's really iconic in the game that everything is overgrown because obviously, that is, part of the story that over the course of time, nature claims back some of those structures and in some cases really quickly. So, they started off with building vines and all of that was hand-placed. They have bespoke tools here that can basically build or can grow vines along specific geometry or surfaces. So, they grew vines over everything and then from those vines decided what leaves should be sitting on there. And in what areas did they want it a little bit denser? And in what areas did they want it to be less dense? And then the next step was to get motion on that, get ambient motion. So everything is slightly moving in the wind. Everything has a little bit of it's just a slight element of motion to it. So, there was a whole bunch of practical elements, like real-life footage that was shot and placed in there by compass wells to help with some of those fine moving grasses and leaves and all of that. So, it was quite an involved process to get it to that level of density. And then also, they had to be careful to still keep the rubble looking in a way that it still had to be unclimbable. So there still had to be rocks and stuff pointing out, and shapes that would prohibit you just easily walking around. Because otherwise, why would you go through a building that clearly looks infected and has giant cordyceps shapes on it, if you could just walk around it? So, yeah, they had to be very specific where they placed the foliage and still maintain that threat of those rubble piles, basically. They also take drone footage of different locations, and they used it to create the deep background where you see the skyscrapers and stuff like that. And then, they projected those buildings onto geometry and aged them and weathered them and knocked some windows out and all of that. And then the entire foreground, the baseball park basically where you see the bleachers and the batting cage and the fences, all the dressing in there, all the trees, all the grass, the ground, that's all completely CG. We will talk about creating and animating enemy creatures. They're using the 3D scans that they're giving them of the creatures. They're looking very closely at the textures and the materials that they had on set, and then reapplying them digitally. And then from there, in some cases, they refine it a little bit to get a slightly different material response, for example, or do some things with the creatures that maybe a prosthetic wouldn't be able to do. But yeah, generally they're always leaning on what's already there and expanding on that in the case of The Last of Us, because the prosthetic work was so great. Artists then create detailed 3D models of the enemy creatures based on the concepts. These models include the creature's body, limbs, textures, and any special features. The models are built using specialized software like Autodesk Maya, ZBrush, or Blender. Textures are applied to the 3D models to give them realistic and detailed appearances. Artists use tools to paint textures onto the models, creating effects like skin, scales, fur, and scars. Shading is also applied to simulate how light interacts with different surfaces. Depending on the creature's abilities and nature, special effects are added. This might include things like particle effects for fire, smoke, or magical abilities. These effects enhance the creature's visual impact and make its actions more dynamic. In fact, some scenes are also created with the help of makeup and special costumes. Proper lighting of objects also plays an important role. But of course, the maximum result can be achieved with the use of 3D graphics and visual effects, which in this movie were also used to create characters. We will talk about creating scenes that use a lot of fire. Artists create detailed 3D models of the environment, including buildings, streets, and props. Textures would be applied to these models to give them realistic and weathered appearances, including signs of decay and wear. Specialized software would be used to simulate fire and explosion dynamics based on real-world physics. Fire simulation would involve factors like temperature, fuel sources, and wind conditions. Explosion simulations would consider shock waves, debris, and structural damage. Artists would focus on small details like how the fire interacts with the environment, the behavior of smoke, and the impact of the explosion on surroundings. Filmmakers, VFX artists, and other creative professionals would collaborate closely to achieve the desired visual and emotional impact. Feedback loops and iterations would refine the effects to meet the storytelling goals. The final composite, including VFX, live-action footage, and sound effects, would be rendered in high resolution. Color grading and other post-production processes would be applied to enhance the overall visual quality. Generally speaking, they used the following materials to create the series, creating detailed and immersive environments that capture the desolate and overgrown landscapes of the game world. Using VFX to add realistic weather effects, such as rain, snow, and fog, to enhance the atmosphere. Designing and animating the various stages of infected creatures, such as clickers and runners, using VFX to make them both terrifying and true to the game's design. Applying particle effects and visual enhancements to portray the fungal infection's growth and movements. Utilizing VFX for scenes involving explosions, damaged buildings, and other destruction in the post-apocalyptic world. Visual enhancements. Enhancing the visual quality and realism of the environments and characters while maintaining the gritty and emotional tone of the game. Implementing VFX for intense action sequences, such as shootouts, stealth encounters, and dramatic moments that are integral to the story. Seamlessly integrating VFX elements with live-action footage to create a cohesive and immersive visual experience. Incorporating sound effects to complement the VFX and enhance the overall cinematic experience.